There's the nationalism that is linked to your identity, to immutable factors emerging from your birth, to convey a certain view of India, of Indian nationalism and of their politics to the electorate, to the Indian public. What your religion is, your color of your skin is, your race is, your creed is, as long as you wish to subscribe. It is assaulting that in the name of creating a Hindu Rashtra anchored in the well-known slogan, Hindi, Hindustan. So my argument is that the ethno-religious nationalism that Hindutva is promoting would end up denying India to many Indians.
Welcome back to another specially curated session of the New Indian Express's Odisha Literary Festival 2020. Today's speaker is one of India's most flamboyant speakers and writers. Perhaps one of his last books describes him best. Have you heard of the Tharoorasaurus? That's right. MP, former diplomat, prolific writer, Twitter celeb, and author of books such as Why I Am a Hindu, Pax Indica, and most recently, The Battle of Belonging. Please welcome Shashi Tharoor in conversation with author and journalist Kaveri Bamzai and TNI's editorial director and veteran journalist Prabhu Chawla.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the Odisha Lit Fest. We have with us Shashi Tharoor, who's remarkably prolific. I don't know how he gets to write so many books. The new one is called The Battle of Belonging on Nationalism, Patriotism, and what it means to be Indian. Here it is, rather handsome looking book. And
Thank you.
I've also got it.
Yeah. And I'm glad to say, in keeping with, of course, his ability to educate us with everything that he writes, I've learned a new word called kakistocracy, right?
That's right.
Which is
government by the least qualified, the most unprincipled.
which really to me is the sum of this book, that we are currently perhaps being led by a kakistocracy.
No, but abuse is not the purpose of the book. I really want to make a very serious argument
about
what is happening to the whole idea of nationalism in our country.
Yeah, of course. But before we do that, Shashi, may I just talk a little about the language, how language can change us as well as delude us. And we've seen that, with the use, for instance, of pseudo-secularism. When L.K. Advani first used it, it became so much part of our culture and part of the way we spoke. And you have the same kind of thing now happening with Hindutva, soft Hindutva, love jihad, tukre tukre gang. All these words have sort of become part and parcel of our culture, of our society. So how important is it how we choose the words we use? Sorry.
No, I mean, I agree with you entirely. Language is extremely important because it helps frame an idea and then communicate it or convey it effectively. I think some of the terms you use actually are turning out to be own goals for those who coined them. Because I think, for example, love jihad, I mean, people are actually by and large in favor of love. It's hatred you want to be opposing, not love. And I think that particular term, to my mind, is not going to do them many favors. In fact, most people react with revulsion to the application by the ruling party of that term. Similarly, this business of tukde tukde gang, who is dividing this nation into tukdes? It is unfortunately those in power today, those who are trying to show that we are Hindus versus non-Hindus, North versus South, Hindi speakers versus non-Hindi speakers. This kind of tukde breaking up of the country is, to my mind, something that's going to come back and bite them in the ankle. But having said that, I agree with you that the terms of art that they use are intended very much to be a shorthand, to convey a certain view of India, of Indian nationalism and of their politics to the electorate, to the Indian public. And that so far anyway, they're doing well with it, even though I do believe there are flaws in their approach.
You talk about nationalism as it ought to be, and you in fact have your own view of what nationalism should be, which you call civic nationalism.
It's not my own view, Kaveri. It is the view enshrined in the Constitution of India.
Indeed. So may I ask you to define that as opposed to the nationalism that we have seen being defined and redefined by this establishment?
Right. So, in the book, I start off the first 100 pages describing the theory and concept and evolution of nationalism, its practice around the world. So it's a global idea. What does nationalism mean? What does it come to mean? I go into 9 different types of nationalism, but I say that at the bottom, it really boils down to 2 kinds. There's the nationalism that is linked to your identity, to immutable factors emerging from your birth, such as your race, your language, the color of your skin, your religion even. These are things that you inherit, and a nationalism anchored in any of those or a combination of those is the ethno-religious or linguistic nationalism as one type of nationalism. And the other type of nationalism is civic nationalism, which is a nationalism of institutions and constitutions. It's a nationalism that derives from the consent of the citizens to participate in a free and democratic society. It's based around core tenets of representative democracy, freedom of expression, constitutionalism, liberal democratic institutions. And it requires voluntary participation in civic society. Whereas the other kind of nationalism you're born into, civic nationalism, you choose to participate in, you choose to be a member of. And it doesn't matter in theory what your religion is, your color of your skin is, your race is, your creed is, as long as you wish to subscribe to the values and principles and institutions of that kind of civic nationalism. Which is why in America, you can migrate to America tomorrow without being white, without being Christian, without having been educated there, without having been born there, and you can become a citizen and participate in their civic nationalism. That's the idea. Now, just as Mr. Trump in many ways is undermining the liberal constitutionalism that underpins that idea in America, in India, the Hindutva movement is essentially assaulting the civic nationalism enshrined in our constitution, a nationalism which safeguards the rights of all citizens, irrespective of their religion, their language, their caste, their creed, their ethnicity, their birth, all of that stuff. It is assaulting that in the name of creating a Hindu Rashtra anchored in the well-known slogan, Hindi, Hindu, Hindustan. And this approach challenges the inclusive, all-encompassing ideology of Dr. Ambedkar, Mahatma Gandhi, Nehru, all the founders and framers of our constitution, and instead excludes people based on some of the immutable aspects of their identity. When you have the CAA coming in and saying anyone can qualify for citizenship unless they're Muslim, then immediately you are introducing a religious test into India's civic nationalism, which thereby is no longer a civic nationalism. So my argument is that the ethno-religious nationalism that Hindutva is promoting would end up denying India to many Indians. And that's a situation that no patriot can truly accept.
We were told that with economic growth, with economic development, identity politics would decline. It would almost disappear. The individual's rights would rise, and the individual would become increasingly demanding of his or her own rights. Why is that not happening? And not just in India, all over the world.
Well, it's a very
people
interesting...
choosing to identify with their caste, their community, with increasingly smaller groups.
It's a very interesting question. I think one can certainly blame it partially on populist demagoguery, but obviously the demagogues are able to appeal to people because people are convinced by them. So the question is why? I don't have an easy answer. I will say, however, that a number of external factors actually have an impact. For example, the globalist viewpoint about nationalism, which actually facilitated the world being a collection of sort of this kind of somewhat more laid-back civic nationalist countries, that became unfashionable because of the growing phenomenon of the hyper-nationalism you saw. And that's partially because globalization has winners and losers, right. And the losers began to resent the winners, and the winners were usually people in other countries, and so resentment and xenophobia and so on came up as well. And unless globalization itself becomes more equitable in the benefits it gives people, an inward-looking isolationist mindset will rise in many countries. We've seen it in Brexit. We've seen it in the American withdrawal from WHO and other international agreements. The COVID pandemic era seems to have inaugurated an era of deglobalization. So all of these things will create propitious ground to encourage the success of the populists, the demagogues, the isolationists, the nativists, and so on. And they in turn want to assert their national sovereignty in the name of the flag, in the name of the nation, and in the process, they essentially undermine the values and principles that I believe our nationalism was created to fight for.
See, I would like to have an interesting question, because I read
sure.
a couple of pages, about 100 pages I've read, and the previous 100 pages, which you're talking more about nationalism, various kinds of international thing. And then you say in the book also that people might think that my Western ideas being imposed on Indian context. This is what you have said somewhere. What the Hindutva forces, what you call them the Hindutva forces, because Hindutva has been coined by a person who was supposed to be liberal. So one can be okay. Hindutva is also a product of a biased mind, because they know nothing like Hindutva. There is Hinduism, there is no Hindutva. According to the Hindutvavadi, we call themselves Hindutva. The question I'm asking you, because you in your last battle of belonging, first is, what is the battle in your mind? Belonging to what? Belonging to, because you have somehow drawn a difference between nationalist and patriot.
Yes.
I'm a nationalist. Does it mean I'm not a patriot?
It's a very interesting question. The truth is that patriotism is merely love for your country, Prabhu. It's like your love for your mother. You love your country because it is yours.
Definition. That's
no,
that
is a widely accepted
for
definition.
Me, nationalism means love for my Bharat.
Let me come to that. So patriotism is about love for your country because it is yours. In other words, because you belong to it and it belongs to you. So your country is yours. It doesn't mean you think it's perfect. It doesn't mean that you want to use this country to beat any other country on the head. You love it because it's yours. And that intimate love, this is something Orwell has written about, Rabindranath Tagore has written about, Shashi Tharoor is standing on some very big shoulders. All I'm saying, therefore, is not my own definition. It's a very clear idea that patriotism as love for country threatens nobody else. Nationalism, however, there is an important distinction. I'm concerned about, as a liberal, which you rightly accuse me of being,
it is a manufactured distinction between nationalism and patriotism.
It is a real distinction. Let me say why. I'll tell you why. As I say in the book, a patriot, see, both patriots and nationalists may die for their country, may sacrifice their lives for their flag. But the difference is that a patriot is prepared to die for his country, whereas a nationalist is ready to kill for his state. Now, that's a very big distinction. The patriot
No. You are making too many questions. Let me stick to one question first. Because kill for his state means, what do you mean by state? Is the nation different than the state?
So the nation state is, as I've described in the book, has come into being.
These are Western definitions. I'm not going to Western definitions.
No.
I'm saying my nation, I was born in a country which is Pakistan now. But that is not my country. I'm not a patriotic. If I say don't worry, Prabhu.
I was born in London, and I can assure you that I'm not a British patriot.
You've written a lot about London. You are entitled to a visa without fees and whatnot. You've written all that because sense of belonging you're talking about.
So my sense of belonging to India is part of my own struggle for belonging. But at the same time, I'm
confused because you're intellectual. I can't argue with you. I'm a Dehati. I want to argue from that point of view. I'm saying I'm proud to be a nationalist who is a patriot. Patriot is also a nationalist because he belongs in the country.
Correct. So
there's no differentiation between a country and a nation for me.
So the question is, what is the idea?
That is what Hinduism is. That is what Hinduism is.
So I've written a different book on that called Why I'm a Hindu, which makes a very consistent point with this.
So I'm asking, you will consider me as a nationalist who is not a patriot. So you have to differentiate between them because what you are defining as Hindutva, that is not Hindutva. That is a political definition of Hindutva.
Correct. Well, Hindutva is a political doctrine.
No, that must be there because then you are talking politics. You are not talking of actual reality of the nation.
So the reality of the nation, as you rightly said, we have a patriotic nationalism. Let's put them two together and not separate them for the moment. Was what inspired the long struggle for independence. And Gandhiji, Ambedkar, and so on saw our nationalism as rooted in India's time-honored civilizational traditions of inclusivity, social justice, religious tolerance and acceptance, and the desire to forge a society that allowed individuals to flourish without barriers thrown up from birth.
Yeah.
So just to say that is what is being distorted by the more exclusionary and sectarian Hindutva version, because They're both nationalists, but a civic nationalist believes in an inclusive nationalism, and patriotism is something that may be in common with both. You love your country because it's yours. I love my country because it's mine. And we each have every right to claim allegiance to it and to claim it belongs to us. But the state institutions of my country that I celebrate will give the same rights to a Muslim or a Christian or a Dalit or a Northeasterner or a Hindi speaker or a Malayalam speaker. And that is what I celebrate. Whereas some nationalists have, shall we say, a more exclusive idea of what it is they're fiercely proud of in their nation and what they believe they're fighting for. So there is a very important distinction.
No, nationalism for me is whatever belongs to India, what was born in India, what happened in India, what was brought up in India, what was imposed in India, the Western culture. I'm coming back to the specifics now. But what belongs to India, what was made in India, what was born in India, what was treated in India, what was created in India. But I am little concerned about the sentence which you are using in your book, in your last chapter. We must remain faithful to our founding values of the 20th century. What do you mean by that? What about the 15th century, before 1000 AD?
No. So as I've explained, the civic nationalism
if we are
I'm talking about,
the looming challenge of the 21st, because you are emphasizing on 20th century, which is the rule of the Congress, which is the rule of the
no,
which is the rule of the culture, which is the rule of civic nationalism, which you are defining. That
Prabhu, you've been skimming, and I don't blame you because it's a big, long book to finish in the time that you've had it. But the fact is that the book makes it very clear. When I speak of the founding, I mean the founding of the Republic through the Constitution of India. So the period from 47 to 50, when all these issues were debated and everyone was there, all the political tendencies in India were present in the Constituent Assembly. I've had the pleasure and immense satisfaction of reading many of these debates, the transcripts of these original debates from that period. Every issue that you and I can argue about today was actually argued about by our founding fathers and mothers, including whether, for example, Hinduism should have a special place in this country, what should be the rights. And one of the most interesting things that I came across was discovering that many Indian Muslims who had migrated to Pakistan in 47 came back in 48. And as a result, there was this whole debate as to whether it is right now that Pakistan has been created for Muslims, how can they come back? And the argument that won out is our country will not discriminate, that we are actually going to be a nation for people of all faiths. So if they want to come back to their homeland, India, and pay allegiance here, they're welcome. Now you've got all of these and in the end, of course, the numbers ended up being rationed because naturally many of those who had left, their places were occupied by incoming refugees. And so it was difficult for for the law and order authorities to manage the influx from Pakistan. So there was a rationing of about 2,000 people per month were allowed to come. That's another story. But I'm just saying, if you look at these ideas, they were all debated. There's nothing new. The founding values of the 47 to 50 Constituent Assembly debates were, we will be a country for everyone who wants to pay allegiance to our democracy, to our institutions, to our Satyameva Jayate principles, and to subscribe loyally to the Indian flag. You remember the story of Brigadier Usman, who could have gone to Pakistan. He was offered a number 2 position in the army there. He stayed on in India and died fighting Pakistan in the 1948 Kashmir War. See, that was the India of the founding period. And I want to recapture and fight again for that India, that an India to which everyone will feel equal allegiance and will not be made to feel that because they're not a Hindi-speaking Hindu, they're a second-class citizen, as some are made to feel today.
So, Shashi, the question which you rightly pointed, civic nationalism, which you're talking about, what about the people who refuse to talk about national anthem and you say that, okay, national anthem is part of the constitution? If they refuse to sing national anthem, are they patriot or they're anti-national?
No, they're not. They're not anti-national because the Supreme Court says they're not anti-national. There was a famous case, the Jehovah's Witnesses case.
You're going to legality now. Legality. I'm talking about perception.
No, but that's the problem.
Hindutva is also perception.
No. Hindutva is a doctrine, ideology with its whole texts and arguments and speeches and so much to read about Hindutva that you and I have read, so we know what we're talking about. This is one particular legal opinion. The Constitution said that the Supreme Court said that according to the Constitution, you have the right to sing the national anthem. You have the right not to sing the national anthem, but you do not have the right to disrespect the national anthem. So the Jehovah's Witnesses have stood up respectfully but refused to sing it because in their religion, they will not sing praise of anyone but their Lord. That was upheld by the Supreme Court, and that's under the Constitution of India. So the civic nationalism of the Indian Constitution is very liberal. I talk about the example of Bharat Mata Ki Jai. Now, I have no problem saying Bharat Mata Ki Jai, and I've said it often enough, but I would respect the right of a fellow citizen of mine who happens to be Muslim and who says that, listen, in my interpretation of my faith, I can say Jai Bharat, I can say Jai Hind, but I will not say Bharat Mata Ki Jai because my religion does not allow me to maternalize or deify my nation as a goddess. He has the right to remain silent, whereas I'm afraid the Hindutva leaders will not give him that right to be silent. This is where we have to re-examine our consciences and ask ourselves, what exactly is our nationalism all about? Are we going to put words in people's mouths, make somebody say something they don't feel? I don't believe we should. I was never in favor of showing the national flag in movie theaters and singing the anthem, because obviously some stood up and felt it, some didn't. It was a practice, by the way, that started at the time of the 65 war, and all of us were deeply emotional about it at that time. As a child, I remember. Today, unfortunately, people are not showing respect because they've gone for entertainment, not to have their patriotism stirred up. And again, wisely, the Supreme Court withdrew that particular requirement after a while and made it optional, and most cinema theaters dropped it. So my point is this: in nationalism, you are a nationalist in one way, which is by paying loyalty and adherence to the institutions of the Constitution of India, the entire democracy that we have been given, granting others the right to disagree with you, accepting that other people will worship differently from you or not worship at all if they don't want to. All of these things are acceptable, but you all pay common allegiance to that Indian three lions emblem, that tricolor Tiranga, and that nation state. And to my mind, that kind of nationalism embraces.
Shashi, in tricolor, saffron got the top position.
Right? Look at me. I mean,
that's right.
I've been wearing the tricolor since
you must have gone to the debates, and when this flag was formalized, why saffron was put on top.
No, but again, this is to my mind. I mean, I agree
with the debate, so therefore I'm asking you that.
Yeah. No, so saffron is on top, and saffron is on top, by the way, the Congress flag also. So even as a Congress politician, I'm just saying.
That's the difference between nationalism, because when you bring in the Congress or the BJP, then nationalism loses its impact.
No. So the BJP only has saffron, whereas the Congress has saffron, green, and white, and the Indian flag is gone because saffron, green, and white way. But let me just say,
the Congress owned India, that's why they got the flag, because they were empowered. They decided, okay, we will decide the flag and we'll decide the party flag also.
It was a nationalist movement after all. And by the way, it was the flag was actually devised by Madame Kama, who was a Parsi lady. So let's accept that India as a civilization embraces diversity, and the flag itself reflects that diversity. Hindutva challenges diversity. They prefer what they call unity is actually uniformity. Whereas my view is that our unity will come out of celebrating our diversity. My argument is you can be many things in one thing. You can be a good Hindu, you can be a good Muslim. I mean, you can be a good Muslim, a good Keralite, and a good Indian all at the same time. You can have allegiance to your Muslim faith. You can have allegiance to your Kerala state. You can have allegiance to the flag of India, provided the flag of India and that nation of India and the Constitution of India triumphs, because it is that which guarantees you the security to be a good Muslim in India or a good Keralite in India. That's my argument. Now, that kind of nationalism.
It's a literature point, because nationalism literature is now emerging out, because for 70 years, the other side of the nationalism was always suppressed. So there were no writers, no voices, only so-called, according to Hindutva forces, according to what they are saying. But they were not allowed to write anything, they were not given any prominence in the institutions. And what Theresa May calls the flexibles have taken over the institutions here, and they try to impose their will, because flexible, as she rightly pointed out, they are nowhere. If it means that citizens, people who are flexible, who can change their whatever. So I'm saying that nationalism, what you are saying and what the BJP and certain sides say, there's a difference. But I'm saying Prime Minister Modi, for example, ever since he has come, the debate has become much more pronounced and much more serious. What has he said which you think is not civic nationalism?
So
as Prime Minister.
So when the Prime Minister personally has been careful not to say too many offensive things as Prime Minister, though he does have a paper trail before that. However, he has done some soft signaling. So when he says that you can tell the rioters by their clothes, you know whose clothes he's referring to. when he refers to Rahul
Maybe I agree
Gandhi.
to saffron clothes as well. They are the writers.
No, yeah, he wasn't
Nahi,
calling.
I'm just asking that why saffron clothes is also writers. They are saying all
It
the
happened.
people
It
we have
happened.
seen.
It happened to be the riots that were provoked by the CAA and the NRC in Assam. That was the time
He
he
said
made
it
that
before
statement.
that. He
And
said
then
it
he made a
before.
statement. He made a statement when Assam was going up in flames, and he had to cancel the trip of Shinzo Abe, the Japanese Prime Minister. They were supposed to meet in Guwahati, and the Japanese cancelled. So anyway, the point is that there is a certain amount of soft signaling. I know you're a cricket fan, as I am, and you know how the umpires do some soft signaling. I think the Prime Minister has done some of that when he calls Rahul Gandhi Shahzada rather than Yuvraj. What is he doing? He's trying to tar him with
Now he
a
started
Muslim.
calling him Yuvraj now. No?
No, no,
Now he
no,
started.
no. He's only said that in Bihar. But the Shehzada thing goes back to two elections, 14
Correct.
and 19. Then similarly, when he talks about Kabristan and Smashan Ghat and so on, I mean, you know that there have been a number of statements which are not directly bigoted, but which very clearly convey a signal that I'm speaking up for a particular community and I'm critical of another community. And that kind of thing, to my mind, is divisive. Now, when you say what is not part of civic nationalism, to my mind, civic nationalism would have required the government to actually show more respect to independent institutions and ideals than it has done. I have been disappointed by many of the ways in which the autonomy and independence of some of our institutions have been hollowed out under this government, and I've gone into that in some detail in the book. But the larger question is, do we strengthen the institutions of our civic nationalism, and do we let everyone feel equally welcome in it? Or do we create an atmosphere in which some are more welcome than others? See, when the Home Minister of India says in Parliament in both houses separately that as far as he is concerned, the NRC and the CAA are going to follow in, I beg your pardon, the CAA and then the NRC are going to follow in sequence. And the CAA means that those who are excluded will have to provide documentation to prove who they are. And the NRC is going to essentially exclude only, shall we say, one community because the others are covered by the provisions of the CAA and they can therefore be given a free pass to remain in this country. Then some real questions are asked because this is the argument that was settled in the different direction in the Constituent Assembly. The argument about whether this is a natural country of the Hindus and everyone else is guests, which is the RSS or Hindutva idea, or whether the argument is that this is a country for everybody who has participated in growing its civilization over the last 3,000 years or 4,000 years, and therefore everyone has an equal claim. I mean, there are Christians in my state of Kerala who were Christian before any European was Christian. Am I going to tell them that they are less Indian because they're not Hindu? I mean, you know, we have to be a little understanding of the very rich, diverse, and welcoming history of our country. And sadly, I don't believe that many in the ruling party have that sense of accommodation and acceptance. I anchor my Hinduism, as you know from my previous book, very strongly in Swami Vivekananda's teachings. I've been a sort of a disciple of his teachings from a very young age, largely because, of course, he did almost all his preaching in English, so I could read him in the original. And he was very clear. He said, listen, the Shiva Mahimna Stotram says that as different rivers, some straight, some crooked, will all flow and end up in the same sea. So also all forms of worship are to the Hindu equally valid. They all end up in the same divine. Ekam Sat Vipra Bahuda Vadanti. And this idea is something which is cardinal to Vivekananda's Hinduism. It's cardinal to Mahatma Gandhi's modern interpretation of his Hindu faith, which is why when he sang Raghupati Raghava Raja Ram, the second line was Ishvara Allah Tero Naam. That idea is a very Hindu idea. It's not a Muslim idea or a Christian idea. It's a Hindu idea, but it's a Hindu idea that embraces in a spirit of acceptance, and that got infused into the drafting of a constitution that equally accepts everybody of every faith. Sadly, we now have a political party that is trying to rewrite the result of a debate that was already settled in the Constituent Assembly 72 years ago.
A quick question, Shashi. Do you think that Hindutva has permanently replaced the idea of Hinduism as a civilization, as a way of life?
No, that's why the title of the book is The Battle of Belonging. The battle is ongoing right now. I believe that there is a battle on the part of the ruling establishment in our country today to move India from the civic nationalism enshrined in the Constitution to a Hindu Rashtra kind of nationalism of Hindutva. And I think that this has to be fought. So my book is an intellectual contribution to fighting this. You know, even it was very interesting, just a couple of days ago, a BJP member of the Rajya Sabha wrote an op-ed in Prabhu's old paper, The Express, the North Indian version, saying that nationalism is something which their party and their view of thinking is deeply anchored in. And on the same page, at the bottom left of the same page, was an article by an intellectual who is not affiliated to any party, saying the problem with the Congress party and the liberals in this country is they abandon nationalism to the bad guys, to the BJP. That was both on the same page. I think it was on Tuesday's Indian Express.
Yes.
Now, what strikes me is that if you look objectively at this, it is a valid criticism that the other op-ed writer, Mr. Agarwal, I think his name was made, because we are the original party of nationalism. The Congress party was a nationalist movement. The freedom struggle was waged under the Congress banner. How did we manage to be supplanted by people with a totally different set of history, with a totally different history to begin with, and a totally different set of ideas, claiming to be authentic nationalists? So my book says we have to recapture the original nationalism of the freedom struggle, which was a civic nationalism, which was inclusive and all-embracing, and we must fight for it courageously.
But
that's my
don't you think creation of just right? Saying that original idea of nationalism to the Congress party.
Yeah.
But with the creation of Pakistan on the basis of religion, don't you think that has an impact on Indian nationalism, which is currently being propagated?
This is precisely what was debated at the time, Prabhu. The argument was, if Pakistan is created as a state for Muslims, should we not de facto be a state for Hindus? And the founding fathers unanimously said, no, our national struggle was waged for everybody. The entire logic of the freedom movement was against Jinnah's.
You didn't get my question. I'm talking about post-independence. The question was, the Congress party lost that uniqueness which it had as a party of nationalists, because you started moving towards what they called a policy of appeasement. You created institutions, you created benefits for a certain section of the society, which BJP or RSS side took advantage of. So you lost that, and in the political advantage, they went on putting you on the defensive. So you lost that advantage. Is it not correct?
So Prabhu,
from Shah Banu case to whatever we talked about, you gave them.
Well, I think I was writing for you in those days. So, I was very critical of the Shah Banu case. My view is simply this, that there is a distinction between the fundamental institutions and principles of nationalism on the one hand, and policy issues on which there are legitimate grounds for disagreement. If BJP can win elections on things like the Shah Banu case, the Ram Janmabhoomi Temple, and so on, their political victory can give them the specific political results they want. But I don't believe it entitles them to challenge the underpinnings of the state. You can certainly challenge specific policies. And I have myself said that every policy in our country that has been imposed by any government should be up for discussion. For example, when I was minister in the MEA for just 1 year, I had challenged the logic of the HUD subsidy, saying that this seems to me to be unnecessarily discriminatory. I'm not sure we're doing any favors to anybody by doing this. It essentially is a subsidy for Air India, but we are giving ourselves and our government this appeasement name. Let's take it off. Unfortunately, I didn't last long enough in the ministry at that time to pursue this line. Today's government has taken that decision, and you may have noticed, I've never objected to it. So it's not that, see, what is sometimes portrayed as appeasement is simply a public policy choice. And all public policy choices in any democracy are legitimately open for discussion and debate, and can be overturned by election results, and can also be overturned by reformist governments changing their own policies. Just as Narasimha Rao undid Jawaharlal Nehru's economic policies in many ways while claiming continuity, that was his magic. Similarly, you could argue that either a Congress government or a BJP government can undo half these policies. It can cancel the BJP government has been in power for 6 years. Have they done anything about the Shah Banu Muslim Women Protection of Rights Upon Divorce Act? They haven't, it's still there. So all I'm saying is that any government can undo the actions of any previous government, but nobody has a right to undo the basic logic of the Constitution, which is that we are a country for everybody. We will not buy into the logic of Pakistan. We will not reduce India into a Hindutva version of Pakistan. That's my point.
No, Shashi, I'm just academic question. If there was no Pakistan, do you think this kind of narrative would have taken place?
Yes, because, again, remember, I'm coming from the south where this is the reality I live and work in every day. In Kerala, as I said, we have Jews going back to before the Ramayana was written. We have, or at least the Mahabharata was written. We have Christians going back to the birth time of the first century after Christ. We have multiple faiths, traders from every faith. Islam came to us in peace through traders and missionaries. And the local Kerala king actually went to Arabia to meet the Prophet in his lifetime. He died there, but as a result, the Kerala coconut.
But Shashi, you are referring to the races which have not offensive, they were not violent. What has happened, the violent invaders, Mughals and whatnot, who destroyed many of the cultural heritages of India, that is the reason for new kind of nationalism which is emerging. You have to accept that.
So I, as you know, have passionately expressed my nationalism against the British who came and raided, looted, killed, and drained our resources to their country. But I don't feel the same way about those who raided, looted, killed, but stayed and spent their loot in this country. There is a big difference. The Mughals mingled their blood with the soil of this nation. From the first Mughal onwards, they had, in fact, Hindu, in very many cases, Rajput wives. And so each son was already progressively less and less a foreigner. So that as far as I was concerned, the Mughals and the courtiers around them and the institutions, the buildings they built, the handicrafts they sponsored,
Are you justifying
all of
what
that is
Mughals,
Indian.
Are you justifying what Mughals did in 1,000 years?
I don't need to justify it. It's happened in the past. It's over. See, history,
but now
history is not something you can take revenge on.
You are criticizing Britishers. You are written
Yeah.
about it. But you are keeping quiet about the atrocity and whatever the Hindus thought to say about the Mughals. That's the whole fight of nationalism now. Cultural nationalism, they are talking about Mughal history. They don't talk about Christians. You are talking at various, during the discourse, you have spoken about Christian, Jews, but you are refrained from speaking about Mughals because...
No, Muslims have also been talked about. I said they came in the lifetime of the Prophet. No,
that's the difference between nationalism, what they talk, and nationalism, what you talk. You don't talk about Mughals, what they did. You are accepting as a cultural, what happened at that time. It was cultural amalgamation of two societies. And what they married, there were Rajput girls, and they married whatever. You're justifying all that, is it?
No, Prabhu. Again, I have described in great detail in my earlier books the atrocities that were committed in the past as well. My main point in responding to what you said was the distinction between those who stayed in this country, who perhaps behaved abominably, but frankly, in those days, it was not a monolithic Hindu versus Muslim. There were Hindus fighting on the Muslim Mughal side. There were Muslims fighting on the Hindu warrior side. Shivaji had Muslim artillery captains. Aurangzeb had the Hindu generals. I mean, frankly, it's all very, it's the period. But what I'm saying is that whatever they did, whatever they built, whatever they stole, wasn't being sent off to Samarkand or Bukhara. It was being spent in India, built in India, devoted to India. The British, what I blame them for is that the sweat of our brow was being taken off and sent off to build mansions in London. That's the big difference. And to my mind, there is a qualitative difference. In neither case am I talking about rage and revenge, which unfortunately many in the Hindutva movement talk about. Because for me, you cannot revenge yourself upon history. History is its own revenge. All I've said about the British is, let us do one thing very clearly. We must learn to forgive, but never to forget. And that's fine. But
that's what they're saying. That's why Hindutva say that we are not forgotten what happened to Indian culture.
Okay, but you have to forgive. You cannot keep on blaming Muslims of today for what some Muslim who may not be even connected to them by blood may have done somewhere. How does a Kerala Muslim whose ancestors may have been converted peacefully by traders and missionaries without a single sword?
I also know, like some elements in the Saffron Parivar, Hindu Parivar do something which is not acceptable to any Indian, even the liberal or whatever. Similarly, there are many more in the other world, the Muslim world, what they do to Indian society. This is not acceptable as well. But since the time is very little, because your literature, when I'm going back to your teacher, David Baker, where you have written about him, that I stayed here, he says, I love it. It's where I am comfortable. I wouldn't dream of living anywhere else. So I felt I should confirm that this is where I belong by taking on that passport as well. Why don't you go in and ask him, have things changed today? No, and find the answer for it. The India which he chose 40 years ago, is it the same India which he trying to live? That will answer, give you more credible answer than the politically committed Shashi Tharoor.
No, he's a scholar of Indian nationalism.
So that's right. His view I would like to hear again.
Yeah, it's not particularly sympathetic to the sectarian view, I can tell you.
Anyway. He's a Christian. He's not an Hindu.
That's true. That's true. So, but India, as I said, in our civic nationalist incarnation, has to be a country that welcomes all. The David Bakers, I talked about the story of Major M.A.R. Sheikh, who died in Pakistani hands in the 65 war. I talk about the story of Ansar Hussain Khan in the book, who fought for 20 years to give up his Pakistani passport and get an Indian passport as a senior UN official because he refused to believe in the two-nation theory, even though he was born in Pakistan, and he won eventually. But all of these stories, India must be a country that appeals to all these people, and it can only appeal to them as a democracy anchored in liberal constitutionalism and sustained by civic nationalism, as opposed to the ethno-religious linguistic nationalism of the Hindutva movement.
This we're playing with words, civic nationalism and cultural nationalism. We have defined so many nationalism.
No, these are not words, these are concepts, these are important ideas.
You use Muslim name and David about your teacher. I would like to give us the names of some Shamsher Singh or some Khan. There are so many Khans and Husains in India. We are proud of them. But give a name, any Sharma or Singh who is popular in Bangladesh as Khans are here. That explains the whole concept of nationalism.
Oh, I don't agree with that, but I think we're getting off on a total tangent. Who the Bangladeshis want to celebrate may not matter to me, though I do know many Bangladeshis who revere Rabindranath. I know many Bangladeshis who revere Rabindranath Tagore, and he's, as you know, a Hindu. So that's not really a valid argument, honestly.
Talking about distinctions.
Yes, Kaveri.
Yeah, talking about distinctions, Shashi. How do you distinguish Moditva and Hindutva, which is another interesting concept theory?
That's been done at much greater length in my book, The Paradoxical Prime Minister, where I came up with the concept and described it over a few dozen pages. The idea is that it's Hindutva plus the personality cult around Modi that gives you Moditva. And Moditva has its own peculiarities because it is certainly anchored in Hindutva, no doubt about it, but it goes beyond Hindutva. Certainly, the original sort of RSS proponents would never be happy with the idea of a personality cult around any leader in the Hindutva movement. They actually believe in self-abnegation. And here we have a man who is essentially, even visually, becoming a sort of Raj Rishi for this country, and trying to portray.
Shashi, I'll correct you here because RSS philosophy is Ek Chalika Nrutitva, that they follow one person. That's the way.
But that one person is meant to be the Sarsang Chalak, is not meant to be the Prime Minister.
So he's Sarsang Chalak of a political party.
So do you think Moditva will triumph over Hindutva? Will that survive even if Hindutva doesn't?
Well, it already is dominant in the era of Mr. Modi, but none of us is immortal. And when the time comes, it will eventually go. The question is whether Moditva will then be supplanted by a return to liberal constitutionalism and civic nationalism, as some of us are fighting for, or whether it'll only give way to a revised form of Hindutva. You see, this is a debate that is still going on, and I don't believe it's only an intellectual debate. It actually tangibly affects the lives of many individuals in our country of all faiths. Absolutely. And I think this is why when you listen to a Kanhaiya Kumar, you listen to Tejasvi Yadav, you realize that nationalism has many manifestations, that to be a Hindu does not necessarily make you an acolyte of Hindutva, Prabhu. And this is why I think we also have to appreciate that what I'm talking about is not just playing with words. These are ideas. The ideas embrace concepts undoubtedly, but they also embrace tangible lived realities for large numbers of our people.
And we've seen it on the streets when people were fighting against CA and
there you are.
It's not or students in JNU. Shashi,
and
thank you very much.
Thank you, Kaveri. Thank you very much. And just, when you mentioned CA, one last word. I saw a photograph the other day of a teenage girl in a hijab holding up a banner saying, "Who the hell are you to tell me I'm not Indian?" And I thought that was absolutely point on. She was right.
That's the problem. That's the problem.
She has the right to claim to be Indian.
You explain Indianism through symbolism. That's what is happening in this question. You pick one example and ignore 20 other examples. That's the fight which Modi is using, or the Moditva forces.
No, I will tell you that as a nationalist, Prabhu, you ought to welcome all those who want to identify themselves with your nation.
No, but
you want to welcome. Your team is getting larger. If you embrace others, your team is larger.
You are not accepting this. For you, symbolism is the only way of proving your liberalism. That is what is harming your nationalism.
It's been a very exciting one. Thank you, Prabhu Tavla. Thank you, Shashi Tharoor. And all the very best for your new book, The Battle of
All the best.
Thank you all.
He's still battling. I think he's still battling.
Still battling. Thanks very much. Take care.
All the best.
And all the best to the people of Odisha.
All the best in your battle. Finally, you will win.
Thank you, Prabhu. I believe so too. Thank you.
Yeah.
We hope you loved this session. Thank you for watching. You can catch the schedule for OLF 2020 and watch all the other sessions at www.newindianexpress.com and www.eventexpress.com. If you're more of a social media person, catch these clips live on our Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube channels.